Hi, welcome to the Minnesota Department of Education's Physical Education Standard Implementation video series. I'm Mary Thyssen-Milder, and I serve as the Physical Education Specialist at the department. In 2018, Minnesota academic standards in physical education were developed by physical educators from across the state. The Minnesota Department of Education facilitated that process and then formed a physical education standards implementation leadership team made up of the co-chairs of the MDE Physical Education Standards Development Team, executive board members of the Minnesota Society of Health and Physical Education, or MNSHAPE, leaders in adaptive physical education representing MNDAPE, and representatives of higher education. Their role is to assist MDE in designing a standard implementation professional development plan. The leadership team designed a 3-year assistance plan to support Minnesota physical educators as they plan for the implementation of the standards in the 2021 to 22 school year. In 2019, we were in the middle of the second year of professional development when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and that put a dramatic pause on the training plan. The COVID-19 pandemic delayed the implementation of the 2018 academic standards in physical education until the 2023 to 24 school year. To assist teachers in reviewing the topics covered in the first year of standard implementation trainings, a snapshots video series was created that addressed the importance of standards, introduced the new Minnesota physical education standards, and broke the standards down one by one. Videos on academic language, learning progressions, deconstructing benchmarks, and bundling benchmarks were also included. These videos can be found on the MDE or MNSHAPE websites. A teacher may watch them in order or go directly to the desired topic and can be viewed individually or in teacher teams. This video is produced as part of the continuation of the second year of standard implementation training. Every second Thursday of the months between February and June of 2022, a new video will be released that focuses on the content identified for the second year of training. The Snapshot series was released in February of 2022. The focus of this video is to identify best practices in physical education grading with a release date of May of 2022. In previous videos, we discussed the purposes, types, and categories of assessments, identified national best practices, and how they can be integrated into daily assessment practices. The content of this video is specific to grading practices. We will identify the differences between assessment and grading, briefly investigate the impact of implicit bias and grading, and discuss how grades are utilized. We will then examine some issues associated with traditional grading practices in physical education and integrate best practice concepts throughout that examination. It's important to say right up front that assessment and grading are not the same. The purpose of assessment is to provide evidence of student learning and student achievement towards outcomes and standards. They provide feedback to students on their progress and information and data that can be used to inform instructional decision-making and inform teaching. The purpose of grading is to describe how well students have achieved the learning objective or goals established for a class or course of study. Grades should reflect student performance on specific learning criteria. Before we talk about grading, I'd like to take a minute to talk about a concept called implicit bias, because it is something that can impact our grading practices. Implicit bias refers to a bias that we are unaware of and which happens outside of our control. It is a bias that happens automatically and is triggered by our brains making quick judgments and assessments of people and situations influenced by our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences. Here are a few characteristics to help us get a better handle on implicit bias. Implicit biases are pervasive. Everyone possesses them, even people with avowed commitments to impartiality, such as judges. Implicit and explicit biases are related but distinct mental constructs. They are not even mutually exclusive and may even reinforce each other. The implicit associations we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. We generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group, though research has shown that we can still hold implicit biases against our in-group. Implicit biases are influenced by peer decisions. Our brains are incredibly complex, and the implicit associations that we have formed can be gradually unlearned through a variety of de-biasing techniques. Implicit bias can affect all of us as we teach physical education and also impact our grading practices. This slide identifies some of the potential areas of biases we may have towards race, gender, weight, disability, religion, or sexuality. There have been some studies that have found that physical educators may be prone to implicit bias regarding weight and gender. Becoming aware of potential implicit bias is the first step in enabling us to consciously address the concept internally as we assess our students. There are many resources available that address how implicit biases can impact our everyday practices and provide suggestions or guidelines to overcome them. I highly encourage you to look into the resources to learn more about it. Now let's begin to address grading practices in physical education. First, it's important to identify how grades are utilized. The primary purpose of a grade is to report the achievement of a student to external audiences, such as communicating to parents, administrators, college officials, and students themselves the degree to which a student achieved learning goals. Performance during the school year represented by grades is also utilized to determine whether secondary students earn credit towards graduation requirements. Employers use grades to indicate the competence of potential employees. Grades can be used to sort students into more advanced classes. Colleges use GPAs as a predictor of student success in higher education. Grades should indicate the proportion of targets that students have mastered and should be based on student achievement. Grades present a summary of a student's major strengths and areas of incomplete learning. To do this, teachers advocate for a standards-based reporting system in which a student receives a score on each standard the class addresses. Progress is reported in terms of whether the student has demonstrated an expected level of performance, for example, proficient or advanced, or has failed to satisfy the grade level expectations, for example, partially proficient or below expectations based on the content area standards. Assessment and grading in physical education come with a unique set of challenges. Often teachers may interact with hundreds of students in a week or even sometimes daily. That makes collecting, analyzing, and tracking assessment data a demanding and challenging task. There may not be agreement among colleagues on how and what to assess or grade within units. There also may be a general discomfort in how to appropriately address the affective domain. And finally, there may be an administrative or school policy regarding grading practice expectations that limit providing accurate descriptions of student progress in physical education. While it's important to acknowledge the common roadblocks, physical educators still need to navigate them the best they can to create a positive learning environment for their students. To do that, let's examine traditional grading practices in physical education. Building assessments to improve performance requires that grades and reports reflect our values and provide appropriate feedback. The problems with some traditional grading practices are when teachers try and factor in non-academic components into a grade, and the meaning of the grade becomes distorted and confusing. The next slides identify some traditional grading practices utilized in physical education. The general concepts of the slides come from a highly credible and renowned source in physical education assessment and grading, Dr. Jacqueline Lund. I have been fortunate to be present for her presentation regarding grading dilemmas in physical education in the 2019 Shape America conference, as well as utilizing her books on performance-based assessment. Traditional physical education practices have included student attendance, dressing out for class, participation, and class behavior. Consider what is communicated to students and parents by these factors. What do factors like attendance and punctuality, being dressed for class, mean to students and parents? These are class managerial issues, not learning targets. It is the student's responsibility to come to class on time, dressed appropriately, and to be ready to learn. These factors lower learning expectations in exchange for students' compliance in a teacher's managerial system. This practice is called a grade exchange, wherein teachers reduce their expectations in return for compliant behaviors. The only way to earn a passing grade is by demonstrating certain knowledge and skills and learning targets defined in the curriculum. That is where they will focus. Managerial concerns should be addressed through class rules and school policies and handled administratively rather than as part of a grade. Let's look at the practice of grading on effort. A teacher says you'll be fine if you just give 100%. What does that mean? Participation? Exertion? What happens when a teacher and student define it differently? How does this practice affect low-fit students versus fit students? The best approach for evaluating effort is to set goals that require effort on the part of the students. Students who complete assessments and assignments are demonstrating effort. Now let's talk about including behavior in a grade. It's important to hold students accountable only if the behavior is part of the standards and is defined in clear, measurable, defensible terms that a student understands. Standards 4 and 5 are in the affective domain. Minnesota benchmark 6.4.3.1 says the student will cooperate with a small group of classmates during gameplay or team building activities, and benchmark 9.4.2.1 says students will exhibit proper etiquette, respect for others, and teamwork while engaging in physical activity or social dance. Teachers should define fair play and appropriate behavior and include them in course objectives, identify behaviors that represent them, and hold students accountable for demonstrating learning. If it is used to calculate grades, there must be instruction associated with it. Grading on improvement is often a moving target. For example, when learning new skills, a novice versus a skilled student, who makes greater gains? In this case, a novice might have the upper hand in scoring. Another issue that may come from grading on improvement is the concept of sandbagging, when a student holds back initially so they can score better later on. Students might improve but not meet the objective. This may identify a need for pre and post tests, which may be a great concept, but time is an issue. The bottom line is that when teachers clearly state criteria for performance, they stabilize the moving target. Goals need to be stated, followed by appropriate instruction, numerous practice opportunities, and chances to test and retest. Now let's look at fitness testing. Many factors other than physical activity influence fitness testing, such as heredity, maturation, chronic age, factors outside of a student or teacher's control. Fitness gains require time, and many programs don't provide sufficient time, which means students may be inappropriately penalized for factors related to program issues. Remember, there is only one standard that addresses physical fitness. It is inappropriate to base a student's grade purely on fitness testing results. It is best practice for assessment to ask students to utilize the results of their fitness tests to set goals and make a plan to reach those goals to improve or maintain fitness levels. They can then be able to identify why or why not those goals were met after the predetermined time. Here are a few best practice tips from Shape America regarding grading on fitness testing. It is appropriate for teachers to use fitness assessments as part of the ongoing process of helping students understand, enjoy, improve, and or maintain their physical fitness and well-being. For example, students set goals for improvement that are revisited during the school year. It is appropriate for teachers to use fitness assessments as part of an ongoing program of physical education, so students are physically prepared in each fitness component so they can complete the assessment safely And finally, teachers should make every effort to create testing situations that are private, non-threatening, educational, and encouraging. Here's a summary of best practice guidelines from Shape America regarding assessment and grading. It is appropriate practice for physical education grades to be based on thoughtfully identified components that are aligned with course goals and state standards, and not based upon athletic ability, a one-time fitness or skill test, dressing requirements and attendance, or unidentified or defined measures of effort, participation, and attitude. It is an appropriate practice for students to know the components of and criteria included in their grade and the rationale for each. Teachers should not use subjective measures, for example, effort, participation, and or dress to assign grades. And finally, data on student achievement should be used to evaluate program effectiveness on a regular basis and not be based solely on personal impressions. It is an appropriate practice for teachers to encourage students to avoid comparison with others and instead to use results as a catalyst for personal improvement. Results should not be interpreted based on comparisons to norms, and students should not be allowed to compare their test scores. It is an appropriate practice for test results to be shared privately with children and their parents or guardians as a tool for developing personal goals and strategies for maintaining and increasing the respective fitness parameters. Test scores should not be posted publicly where others can view and compare them. And finally, it is an appropriate practice for teachers to provide regular reports of student progress to students and parents or guardians using a variety of continuous formative evaluations and assessments. For example, heart rate monitor printouts, pedometer step sheets. The last piece of advice for this video is to assess everything, but don't grade on everything. You don't have to include all scores in grades. A variety of assessment strategies are needed depending on the purpose. Formative assessments offer directions for improvement and adjustment during the instruction and learning process. Summative assessments provide information to make judgments about a student's achievement at the end of a period of instruction and learning. Not everything assessed needs to be graded. Determine the weight of assessments and determine which will be included as part of a grade ahead of time. This slide provides snapshots of quality articles available that address grading in physical education. I encourage you to read the articles and to initiate conversations with your colleagues regarding your current grading practices. Utilize the concepts brought forward in this video as starting points for your conversations. Thank you for viewing this video on best practices in grading in physical education. Special thanks to members of the MDE Physical Education Standards Implementation Team for the development of the content and for their continued guidance in supporting quality physical education in Minnesota. A reminder that the foundational videos on standard implementation are covered in the Snapshots Physical Education Standards video series that can be found on the MnShape and MDE websites. Look for the next video in June of 2022 that puts together all the concepts of this video series in applying physical education standards-based assessment and grading practices in physical education. Thank you.